Good morning, Radio Days Europe Podcast Day. I'm Tom Webster, and I'm so sorry I could not be there with you this morning. I surely wanted to be, but the travel gods did not smile upon me last night, and I missed a few connections, and well, here we are. But I'm very appreciative of Peter and everybody else at Radio Days Europe Podcast Day for giving me the opportunity, nonetheless, to speak to you. And what I want to talk to you about this morning, just for a few moments, is kind of a reflection on the things that I've seen throughout the 14 years or so that I've been researching the podcast space. This year, for those of you that are familiar with our Infinite Dial research series, this year we've done Infinite Dial studies in partnership with Triton Digital in 3 different countries. We've done them in the United States, in Canada, and in Australia as well. And I want to share a trio of numbers from each country, because I think they're very consistent. They say the same thing, and I suspect they would be the same in your country if we were to do that there. And I'm going to compare 3 sets of numbers. First of all, the percentage of the population that are familiar with the term podcasting. That doesn't mean they know what it is. It just means they're familiar with the term. Second, the percentage of people that are listening to podcasts at least on a monthly basis. And finally, the percentage who say they're listening on a weekly basis. And I think we can take them to be really the people who have adopted podcasting as a habit. So in the United States, 64% of the country, nearly 2/3 of the country, is familiar with the term. They say they've heard the term podcasting. And again, it doesn't mean they know what it is, but it's at least not an unfamiliar word to them. In terms of monthly listening, 26% say they've listened on a monthly basis, and on a weekly basis, 17%. And really the gap I want to focus on here is between familiarity at 64% and weekly listening at 17%. Now, we've also done the Infinite Dial series in Canada, and 61% of Canadians are familiar with the term podcasting, and 19% have listened on a weekly basis. And finally, in Australia, that ratio is 78% familiar and 13% have listened on a weekly basis. Now, here's the point I want to make here. The percentage of people that are listening to podcasts on a weekly basis is anywhere from 1/4 to 1/5 or even less of the percentage of people who say that they know what they are. That's not great. That's not a really great ratio. If you have 2/3 of the country familiar with the term, but only 17% of that sample population is listening to podcasts on a weekly basis, then you've got nearly half of the country, regardless of what country we're talking about here. And again, we see the same things in the United States, in Canada, and in Australia. Nearly half of the country says that they know what a podcast is, but it's not part of their weekly habit. And this is what I want to address today in terms of what we all in this room, or me in my room here in Boston, and you out there, have to think about as you're moving forward with your podcast ventures and your strategy. There are, I think, 4 levers here to make podcasting grow and to increase that ratio between the percentage of people who say they know what a podcast is and the percentage of people who listen to one every week. I think there are 4 levers. 2 of them are out of your control, and 2 of them, I think, are in your control. The 2 that are out of your control, number 1, and really, this is kind of the elephant not in the room. I hope they're in the room, but if you're in the room, elephant, I'm talking to you, and that's Google. Podcasting has been, to date, very Apple-centric in terms of the ecosystem. It was named after the iPod. It's a quaint, anachronistic term today, but we're stuck with it. I'm not going to tell you that we need to change the name, but I am going to tell you that it probably hasn't helped. What we really need is a strong Google Play into the podcast ecosystem, and I believe that's coming very, very soon. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's coming very, very soon. So that's the thing that's going to help us. That's the thing that's going to help grow our audience, and that's a lever that is not in your control, but what is in your control is how you can respond to that, because the Android user is a very different human to the iPhone user. We know this from years and years of research in both spaces. What we see on the iTunes podcast charts, for example, very reflective of the iPhone user in terms of psychographic, demographic, and etc. The Android user is very different, and I think we have to be prepared for the opportunity that an increased percentage in terms of the share of ear, to use an Edison term, for Android consumption, what that means in terms of content. That's one. The second thing that's going to happen, which is, I think, going to grow the space, is the increased adoption of podcasting amongst the major streaming audio players. And I'm talking here about the streaming music providers like Pandora here in the United States and Spotify around the world. Both of those players are increasing their investment and their interest in podcasting. It makes a lot of sense to keep people on those platforms if they want to hear spoken word content. And that's incredibly important for the space because those are true cross-platform clients to listen to podcasts. We don't need to explain things like subscribing and downloading and things like that if people are already used to using Spotify and can just click on another channel, another button on the app that they're already used to listening to hear a podcast. That's incredibly important for us. So having that kind of a universal cross-platform client for podcasting, that's going to help grow the space as well. So those are the two things that you in this room cannot control. But here are the two things that you can. First of all, I mentioned before about how different the iTunes audience is from the Android audience. They're different people. Right now, a lot of podcasting is geared towards what I would call highbrow content. Look at the top 100 podcasts in iTunes. There's a lot of public media content, a lot of US-centric public media content, and that's geared towards kind of a highbrow audience. But as I've said before, and I wrote about this way back in 2015, I think, if you look at the top iTunes podcast charts and you look at the television ratings, and you can do this in your own country as well, they're two very different lists. On the one hand, you have things like Serial and This American Life and S-Town and TED Talks and things like that. But on the, at least in terms of the American TV ratings, it's things like Law and Order and CSI and live sports and a lot of really mass appeal content. And that content has not really broken through on the podcast charts yet. I think it will, and I think it has to. And coming up with a variety of solutions to do that is very important, I think, to everybody in this room. To make podcasting truly mass appeal, you have to think about mass appeal content, and you have to think about creating content in the same way that you create content for your radio stations or whatever other entities that you're currently programming. You have to be audience first, and I think so many podcasts are not audience first. They're what I want to talk about, and here you go. Instead of being, what are the needs of this particular audience that I want to reach? Either reach from a sales perspective, reach from a public media perspective. How can I reach them effectively? And that content's just not being produced at the same volume as what I would call highbrow content. But here's the fourth lever, and the last thing I want to leave you with, and that's this. Here in the United States, also in Canada, also in Australia, also in your country, the percentage of people who are familiar with the term podcasting, it's probably at least 2/3 of the country. But of that percentage, I know, I'm not just willing to bet, I know that many of them, they may have heard the term, but they don't know what it is. They don't know what podcasting is. They don't know why they would want to listen to one. They don't have a reason to subscribe to one, which is a term I've always hated. They have not been given a compelling definition, reason, or anything really that would convince them that I need to try this new thing. And that's where everybody in this room needs to come together. Because what podcasting really needs is a commitment from the people producing content, and this really addresses the last two levers that I talked about, to number one, produce the kind of content that a variety of people want to hear. And number two, sell the show. We are not going to be able to sell podcasting just on the fact that podcasting is some special snowflake. We have to sell the show. We have to teach people why they would care. We have to teach people what a podcast is. We have to teach people that it's already accessible to them. The app is already on their phone. It's free to listen to. And it's content that they want to listen to. We rely way too much on cross-promotion and within podcast advertising. But what we really need to do is reach out to people, explain to them what a podcast really is and why they should care. We have a great opportunity now with Pandora, Spotify, Google all stepping into the fray. We have a great opportunity to create different types of content and more compelling forms of content. And we have a responsibility to tell people why they should care. And I hope you do. Thanks, everyone, and I hope to see you next year.